November 26, 1943. Above the German city of Bremen, the sky stretched cold and endless. Major Francis Gabreski's pencil trembled slightly as he bent over his logbook in the cockpit after touching down safely. The words he was writing seemed almost unbelievable. Just 8 months earlier, experienced RAF pilots had openly scoffed at the idea that the enormous Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could hold its own against the nimble German fighters that had dominated the skies over Europe. They said it was too heavy, too unwieldy, too slow to turn. The Luftwaffe would learn something different. The Luftwaffe would learn to fear the dive. Through the frost-coated canopy at 28,000 feet, Gabreski had just witnessed his squadron execute a maneuver that turned everything the pilots knew about aerial combat upside down. For generations, fighter pilots had been taught that air superiority meant turning radius and climb rate. They turned horizontally, twisted with their enemy, tried to get behind them. But Gabreski's pilots had done something radical. They rolled their massive fighters inverted and dove straight down at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, a velocity that would have ripped the wings off virtually any other fighter in the entire European theater. The German pilots in their Bf-110s never saw death descending from above. One moment they climbed confidently toward the vulnerable B-17 flying fortresses. In the next moment, 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns from a fighter that seemed to materialize out of the sun itself poured devastating fire into their fuselages. 8 guns cycling at nearly 800 rounds per minute each, creating a storm of lead that no pilot could possibly survive. The mathematics of air supremacy were being rewritten in real time. It was no longer about who could turn the tightest or climb the fastest. It was about physics. It was about a nearly 4-ton fighter plunging toward the Earth, building up tremendous speed and energy, then using that accumulated momentum to zoom back up to altitude, where thin air and turbocharging gave American pilots an advantage no German could match. Gabreski had destroyed 2 Bf-110s that day using these exact tactics, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for protecting the bomber stream below. The transformation that made this possible had begun many months earlier, on April 13, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over the occupied French coast near Saint-Omer. The pilots were tense that morning. 8 months of training in the P-47 Thunderbolt filled them with doubt. Many remained skeptical. The aircraft was simply massive, nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded in standard combat configuration and up to 17,500 pounds when carrying external stores and drop tanks. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. It outweighed the graceful Supermarine Spitfire by 4,000 pounds. It dwarfed the Focke-Wulf FW-190 by 3,000 pounds. Critics called it a milk bottle. The pilots called it the 7-ton milk jug, eventually shortening that to just the jug. RAF pilots, who had successfully defended Britain in their nimble Spitfires, openly questioned whether such a massive, lumbering aircraft could possibly survive against experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying agile German fighters. Among the skeptics was Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson, fresh from pilot training and genuinely terrified that he would die in his first week of combat. His personal accounts, documented in multiple post-war interviews, and his memoir co-written with Martin Caden, would chronicle one of the most remarkable transformations in aviation warfare history. But before Johnson could prove his worth in the air, the P-47 itself had to prove its worth. The journey from doubt to dominance began at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island. There, a Georgian engineer named Alexander Kartveli had designed something radically different from every other fighter in existence. Kartveli had famously sketched the P-47 design on a train after learning that his previous XP-44 project had been cancelled. He later described his creation with typical engineer's humor as a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions. The P-47 was built around something enormous: the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, generating 2,000 horsepower at sea level at rated power, with water injection capable of boosting output to 2,300 horsepower when combat emergencies demanded maximum effort. Some later variants, like the P-47M, would eventually produce 2,800 horsepower, making them among the most powerful piston engine fighters ever constructed. This immense raw power was channeled through a sophisticated turbo supercharger system buried deep in the rear fuselage. This system became the key to everything the P-47 could achieve. Hot exhaust gases were piped along both sides of the cockpit through extensive ducting, driving a General Electric turbine mounted in the belly of the aircraft. This turbine spun at 21,300 revolutions per minute at full power. It compressed the incoming air and fed it back to the engine through an intercooler system that lowered temperatures and increased density. The result was revolutionary. The system allowed the R-2800 to produce maximum power at 27,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, in the thin stratosphere where other fighters gasped for oxygen and struggled for power, the Thunderbolt remained faster and more powerful than any German fighter in the sky. The P-47 could operate effectively all the way up to its service ceiling of 42,000 feet, an altitude where Luftwaffe pilots found their aircraft struggling desperately for any performance at all. But this remarkable capability came with a significant cost in weight. The turbocharger system, with its complex ducting, the extensive armor plating protecting the pilot, including a 69-pound armored headrest and thick armor plate behind the seat, the self-sealing fuel tanks holding 370 gallons of fuel internally, and 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns with 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds of ammunition. All of this created an aircraft that skeptics believed was simply too heavy to maneuver effectively in a dogfight. The empty weight alone exceeded 9,000 pounds. Combat-loaded weight pushed past 14,000 pounds before any external stores were added. Lieutenant Johnson wrote in a letter home after his April 13th first mission, describing the challenges he could see clearly ahead of him. The Germans had been fighting this war for years. We were entering combat in an aircraft that many believed was the wrong tool for the job. Yet Colonel Zemke seemed confident we would find our way. The missions through late April and into May 1943 were cautious operations. Fighter sweeps over the coast, learning the terrain, testing equipment, building experience gradually without rushing into major engagements that could devastate an inexperienced unit. The first real test came on June 12, 1943, during a mission designated RAF Rodeo 204 over the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron spotted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 at lower altitude near Blankenberge, Belgium. Following the altitude advantage doctrine that Colonel Hubert Zemke had been drilling into his pilots relentlessly, Cook dove on the unsuspecting German fighter. He fired a burst from his 50 caliber guns and watched the FW-190 tumble toward the ground, trailing smoke. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed aerial victory. It had been achieved using the diving attack that would become their trademark tactic. The very next day, June 13, 1943, brought the 56th Fighter Group 3 more victories, validating the tactics Zemke had been developing. Lieutenant Robert Johnson scored his first kill that day, diving from altitude onto an FW-190 over Belgian territory. The German pilot never saw him coming. Johnson fired a precise burst, saw his rounds strike home, watched the enemy fighter spin into the ground. When Johnson landed, Major General Carl Spaatz, commanding the entire 8th Air Force, personally presented him with a bottle of Scotch whiskey to mark the occasion of being among the first 8th Air Force pilots to score victories in the new P-47. But Johnson also learned a harsh lesson that same day. His element leader had not followed to provide cover during the attack. Johnson found himself isolated and under attack by multiple German fighters, closing in from different angles. He was reprimanded by his commanders, including Zemke, Gabreski, and Captain Gerald W. Johnson, for breaking formation during the engagement, even though his kill was confirmed. The incident highlighted something critical. Diving attacks required coordinated execution and mutual support. Individual glory meant nothing if pilots were lost to enemy fighters during or after their attack runs. But nothing in those early missions had prepared the pilots for what would be discovered during high-altitude testing back in the United States. On November 13, 1942, months before the 56th Fighter Group had even deployed to England, Two test pilots named Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer had pushed their P-47C Thunderbolts into near-vertical dives from 35,000 feet during high-altitude performance testing. What happened next would prove crucial to understanding the P-47's true capabilities and its dangerous limitations. The airspeed indicators climbed past 500 miles per hour, past 600, eventually showing 725 miles per hour indicated airspeed. The actual true airspeed was certainly lower, probably in the 550 to 600 mile per hour range, because pitot-static instruments become increasingly inaccurate at high speeds and high altitudes. Republic Aviation would later claim the pilots had exceeded the speed of sound, making them the first humans to break the sound barrier. This claim was disputed by many aviation experts. General Henry Hap Arnold sent a telegram to Republic ordering that there would be no further discussion about the dive. Post-war analysis and subsequent testing indicated the highest confirmed Mach number achieved by any World War II propeller-driven fighter was approximately 0.92 Mach, achieved by a specially modified Supermarine Spitfire. P-47s likely did not exceed this threshold. Nevertheless, what Comstock and Dyer experienced during those dives proved absolutely critical for combat operations. Beyond approximately 550 miles per hour indicated airspeed, they encountered severe compressibility effects. The localized airflow over the wings approached transonic velocities. The controls became rigid, completely unresponsive to normal stick inputs. The aircraft were diving nearly straight down, accelerating continuously, and conventional recovery seemed impossible. Both pilots experienced tunnel vision from the crushing G-forces and genuine terror as their aircraft plunged earthward with controls frozen solid. But Comstock and Dyer both managed to recover. Their technique would be taught to every P-47 pilot who followed. The critical procedure, later documented by combat pilots including Charles D. Moore, was to push firmly on the control stick with both hands while keeping the trim tabs locked in neutral position. Pilots were explicitly warned never to adjust trim tabs during compressibility recovery. Over-control would likely result when the aircraft descended into denser air and controls suddenly regained responsiveness. The correct technique required using manual stick pressure, pulling firmly but not desperately, maintaining that pressure while the aircraft descended through the compressibility region. As the P-47 descended into denser air at lower altitudes, usually below 15,000 feet, the compressibility effects would gradually diminish. The elevators would slowly regain effectiveness. The aircraft would begin responding to control inputs, and the pilot could then complete the pullout. Both Comstock and Dyer bottomed out their recoveries with less than 2,000 feet to spare. Their bodies compressed into their seats by forces exceeding 7 or 8 times gravity. When they landed and reported their experience to Republic Aviation and Wright Field engineers, the response was immediate and thorough. Every P-47 pilot would receive extensive training in recognizing compressibility onset and executing proper recovery procedures. More importantly, engineers discovered that the P-47's thick wing design, which made it a poor turner compared to thinner-winged fighters, actually delayed the onset of critical compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt could dive faster and recover more reliably than any contemporary fighter. Later P-47D variants would be equipped with dive recovery flaps, small surfaces that could be deployed during high-speed dives to help manage compressibility and assist with recovery. This capability would prove absolutely decisive in combat. Throughout May and June 1943, Colonel Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly in the tactics that would exploit the P-47's unique strengths. Climb to 30,000 feet or higher before reaching the combat area. Maintain disciplined formation with proper spacing for mutual support. Never chase enemy fighters down to low altitude where the P-47's weaknesses in turning and acceleration became exposed and dangerous. When enemies appeared below, roll inverted to keep the target in sight. Pull 4 or 5 Gs to point the nose downward. Dive at maximum throttle setting. The accumulated speed often exceeded 480 miles per hour and sometimes reached 500 miles per hour or more, making the P-47 nearly impossible for German fighters to evade. The attacking pilot would fire a burst from 850 caliber machine guns, each gun cycling at approximately 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire around 6,400 rounds per minute or over 100 rounds per second. At high closing speeds, even a 2-second burst delivered devastating firepower that shredded enemy aircraft. Then, before German fighters could react or defensive measures could be taken, the P-47 pilot would pull back firmly on the stick and use all that kinetic energy to climb back above the fight, regaining altitude advantage within 40 to 60 seconds. The skeptics remained numerous through those early months. Many pilots found it difficult to abandon traditional fighter tactics that emphasized turning and twisting to get behind the enemy. Some questioned whether running away in a dive could truly be called fighting. On June 26, 1943, during escort duty for B-17 bombers returning from a mission to Villers-Coublay in France, 48 P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 near Forges-les-Eaux. The engagement would prove both costly and educational. Lieutenant Johnson's P-47, nicknamed Half-Paint, was hit early in the fight by multiple 20mm cannon shells. His canopy shattered. Hydraulic lines were severed, spraying fluid across his windscreen. The cockpit caught fire briefly. Shrapnel from exploding cannon shells struck Johnson's nose, causing bleeding and partial disorientation. Most pilots would have abandoned the aircraft immediately. Johnson discovered his canopy would not open, trapping him in the dying fighter. With no choice but to fly or die, Johnson pushed the nose down and dove for the English Channel at maximum speed. An FW-190 followed, firing repeatedly into the already crippled P-47. More cannon shells tore through Johnson's wings and fuselage. The German pilot apparently expended all his ammunition on the defenseless American fighter. Then he flew alongside, looked directly at Johnson, saluted, and broke away. Whether this represented respect for courage or simply acknowledgement that further attacks were pointless, Johnson never knew. But the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine continued running despite taking multiple hits. The robust airframe, designed with thick structural members and redundant systems, held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson coaxed the battered P-47 across the English Channel, found RAF Manston, an emergency airfield, and executed a perfect landing despite having almost no forward visibility through the hydraulic fluid-coated windscreen. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the aircraft without completely circling it. The right wing had structural members severed. The fuselage had holes large enough to insert a fist. Hydraulic systems were completely destroyed. Yet Johnson walked away with only minor injuries from shrapnel. Remarkably, the P-47 was eventually repaired and returned to service. This mission cost the 56th Fighter Group 4 aircraft and pilots, their worst single mission loss to date. But it also demonstrated the P-47's extraordinary ability to absorb punishment and bring pilots home alive. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, provided the first major validation of diving attack tactics on a large scale. The 8th Air Force launched 376 heavy bombers in a daring double strike against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft production facilities at Regensburg, deep in Germany. The bombers would fly hundreds of miles beyond the escort range of most Allied fighters. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were assigned to provide penetration escort for the Regensburg force, taking the bombers as far as fuel allowed before turning back toward England. Major Gabreski, leading elements of the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioned his flights at 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the bomber stream. German fighters were climbing from multiple airfields across northern France and Belgium. Approximately 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s, in several formations, timing their arrival to catch the bombers when P-47 escort would be at the limit of their fuel range. What the German pilots did not expect was the coordinated diving attack from superior altitude. P-47 flights rolled inverted simultaneously, pointed their noses at steep dive angles between 45 and 60 degrees, and accelerated toward the climbing German fighters at speeds the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered in combat from American fighters. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes and spread across 70 miles of German and Belgian airspace. P-47 pilots executed textbook diving attacks, struck hard, and recovered to altitude for repeated attacks. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 German fighters destroyed, 9 damaged, and 1 probable for the loss of 3 P-47s. German records documented 22 aircraft lost that day across all units, with 11 pilots killed and 8 more wounded. Among the dead was Major Wilhelm Herget, Gruppenkommandeur of the 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26. His brother was the famous General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most celebrated fighter aces. Wilhelm had scored 55 victories before encountering P-47 diving tactics he could not counter. Captain Walter Beckham of the 56th Fighter Group was credited with the probable kill, diving from altitude at over 480 miles per hour and striking Herget's FW-190 with a concentrated burst. The German fighter disintegrated from the concentration of 50 caliber rounds. Herget's body was found 2 months later, still strapped in his seat, driven 12 feet into the ground by the impact. The psychological impact on remaining Jagdgeschwader 26 pilots was profound. One of their most experienced leaders had been killed by tactics he never saw coming. More importantly for the strategic picture, the bomber stream lost far fewer aircraft than expected during the period when P-47 escort was present. The invincible Luftwaffe had finally met its match. The P-47 Thunderbolt had earned its place as a genuine threat to German air power. The fighters proved they could shield the bombers that were systematically dismantling Germany's war machine. What truly counted was whether the bombers got through safely and could continue their devastating campaign. Kill statistics were only meaningful if they protected the bombing fleet. By October 1943, the P-47's diving attack strategy had fully come into its own, producing kill ratios that seemed unbelievable just half a year before. That month's missions revealed what dedicated, well-trained pilots executing sound tactics could accomplish. On October 4th, during an escort run to Frankfurt, the 56th Fighter Group ran headlong into roughly 60 German fighters, making a desperate push to strike the bomber stream near Cologne. Capitalizing on their height advantage and executing precisely coordinated diving strikes, the 56th ripped through the German formation, destroying around 15 Bf-110 twin-engine machines and several single-engine fighters, claiming 16 kills total, while suffering just 2 P-47s lost, both to anti-aircraft fire, not enemy pilots. 4 days later, on October 8th, a young lieutenant named Johnson, flying as wingman to Captain Gerald W. Johnson, executed another textbook diving pass that brought his personal tally to 4. Cruising at 29,000 feet above Bremen, Johnson spotted an FW-190 bearing down on another P-47 from a position the victim couldn't see. Johnson flipped his bird inverted, hauled back on the stick with 4 Gs of force to line up his nose with the German fighter beneath him, and shoved the throttle forward to full emergency power. As his speed climbed to 460 miles per hour at 26,000 feet, his trigger finger tightened. 8 machine guns blasted their fire across the Fokker-Wulf's fuselage. Pieces ripped away from the German aircraft as Johnson watched. The fighter rolled over and began its death spiral toward Earth. Without hesitation, Johnson yanked his Thunderbolt into a climbing turn, gained 3,000 feet of altitude in barely 30 seconds, and slid back into formation, ready to cover the next pilot who needed help. From the moment Johnson tipped his wings to the instant he regained altitude took roughly 50 seconds total. This was boom and zoom warfare stripped down to pure mechanics. 2 days passed, and on October 10th, Johnson achieved ace status during a massive free-for-all over Munster. The squadron intercepted roughly 40 German fighters, converging on B-17s, making their escape from the target. In the chaos that erupted, Johnson rolled into 3 separate dives within 25 minutes, destroying 1 Messerschmitt Bf-109, 1 Bf-110 twin-engine fighter, and 1 Fokker-Wulf FW-190, pushing his score to 5 confirmed victories and crossing into ace territory. Johnson had no way of knowing that one victim that day was Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, the commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 1, a decorated veteran with 206 total air victories, including 177 on the Eastern Front and 29 in the West. Johnson wouldn't discover this pilot's identity for half a century, only when researchers from both countries compared their combat records. That aggressive day came with a price, though. During his final diving run, German tracers found their mark. Cannon shells from a Bf-110's rear gunner tore through his right wing and fuselage, destroying hydraulic lines and mangling flight surfaces. Smoke poured from the wounded Thunderbolt as hydraulic fluid bled away rapidly. Johnson aimed the damaged machine toward England and began what would turn into one of the most grueling flights of his existence. German pilots spotted the crippled fighter and moved in for an easy kill. 3 times FW-190s came in for the finishing pass. 3 times Johnson pushed his nose forward, accelerated past 400 miles per hour despite mangled controls and violent vibration, and left them behind. Even torn up, the P-47D could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe flew. Johnson nursed the shaking, smoking machine across Belgium and over the Channel, losing altitude steadily. An emergency field appeared below. Johnson brought the battered fighter down in a smooth landing, despite heavily damaged controls and forward visibility reduced to almost nothing. The ground crew stared in disbelief. The P-47D was a flying sieve. Over 200 bullet and shell holes pocked the fuselage. The right wing had suffered massive structural damage, with spars torn completely through. The fuselage was riddled with penetrations that struck deep into vital systems. Yet the mighty Pratt & Whitney engine had kept running flawlessly the entire way, dropping only 1 or 2 of its 18 cylinders. The airframe held together against punishment that should have brought it down. Johnson climbed out without serious injury. After extensive work in the repair shop, the Thunderbolt returned to flying combat missions. These October engagements proved something beyond just diving tactics themselves. The P-47 combined offensive punch through high-speed dives with defensive staying power, through rugged construction and built-in redundancy. Pilots could press attacks hard, secure that if hit, the plane would probably carry them home. That confidence inspired bolder tactics and superior results. By November, the 56th doctrine had become standard throughout the 8th Air Force. Every P-47 squadron learned to think in 3 dimensions instead of flat turns. Altitude meant survival. Speed meant safety. Discipline equaled success. Never chase a foe downward unless bomber defense absolutely required it. Never turn when you can dive. Never engage fairly when you can attack from complete advantage. The numbers from this period tell a remarkable story. From June through December 1943, with tactics fully developed and pilots accumulating combat hours, the 56th Fighter Group racked up kill-to-loss ratios approaching 11-1 when counting only aircraft lost in air-to-air combat. Add in all operational losses from mechanical problems, weather and ground fire, and the ratio still topped 5-1. When looking only at fights where P-47 pilots stayed disciplined about altitude and stuck to diving attacks, kill ratios jumped above 15-1 and sometimes hit 20-1 under perfect conditions. The tactics worked because they obeyed physics that couldn't be beaten by pilot talent or clever thinking. A P-47 sitting at 30,000 feet held potential energy equal to 9.4 million foot-pounds. Diving down to 20,000 feet converted that to pure speed, producing dives approaching or exceeding 500 miles per hour. No German fighter could safely match that velocity. The FW-190's maximum safe dive speed, topped out around 450 miles per hour, indicated airspeed before the airframe faced serious structural risk. The Bf-109 had similar limits, plus handling troubles at high speed. Once a P-47 pilot fired on a target at 20,000 feet and pulled 4 or 5 Gs to recover, accumulated energy allowed him to zoom back up to 28 or 29,000 feet. The whole cycle, down from 30,000 to 20,000 and back up to 28,000, consumed less than 90 seconds and burned minimal fuel. A German fighter trying to climb from 20,000 to 30,000 feet needed 4 to 6 minutes and burned substantial fuel while his engine weakened with every 1,000 feet gained. By late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots were noticing the problem. German combat reports started mentioning avoiding P-47s above 25,000 feet. Entire squadrons quit climbing high, instead focusing attacks on bombers during climb-out or descent when American fighters had less advantage. but that exposed German fighters to bomber machine guns and cut attack effectiveness sharply. Major Günther Rahl, who commanded the second group of Jagdgeschwader 11 for a month spanning mid-April to mid-May 1944, before being shot down and wounded, later explained German thinking in post-war talks. By late 1943, Rahl observed that experienced German pilots understood the P-47 became deadliest with height advantage. American pilots were learning to exploit their machine properly, refusing to be drawn down where German fighters turned better and accelerated harder. Instead, P-47s hit from above repeatedly, diving so fast German eyes could barely track them, squeezing off quick bursts and climbing away before Germans could respond. If German fighters climbed to meet them, Americans simply climbed higher using better high-altitude engine power. The only partial solution was striking bombers fast from low altitude and fleeing before thunderbolts could pounce. Yet that gave German pilots less time to aim, and bomber defensive fire was more accurate against low-level attacks. Rahl made it through the war with 275 total victories, third highest in aviation history, and later flew for West Germany from 1956 to 1975. These diving tactics demanded outstanding physical preparation and technique. Pulling out of a 500-mile-per-hour dive generated forces exceeding 7 Gs. Blood rushed downward from the head. Vision compressed into a tunnel. Some pilots blacked out momentarily at the dive's bottom, coming to only as the aircraft began leveling naturally. P-47 pilots borrowed anti-G techniques from dive bomber schools to prevent this. They tensed leg and abdominal muscles fiercely during pullouts, essentially raising blood pressure and keeping blood flowing to the head. They grunted and shouted hard, forcing pressure into lungs and chest. They trained themselves to limit pullouts to 6 or 6.5 Gs when feasible, accepting slightly shallower recovery angles to reduce blackout chances while still gaining good zoom climb performance. Youth and fitness, combined with these methods, kept most pilots conscious and sharp throughout attacks. Still, the physical burden accumulated relentlessly. Pilots flying several high-energy missions daily returned completely exhausted. Bodies ached from repeated crushing forces. Some developed vision problems from constant G-force exposure. Others suffered chronic back pain from spine compression during pullouts. As 1943 turned to 1944, the intensifying bombing campaign pushed deeper into Germany, bringing new challenges. On January 11th, during an escort mission to Oschersleben deep in central Germany, the 56th encountered over 100 German fighters in a frantic bid to shatter the bomber stream. The fight lasted nearly an hour and scattered across 150 miles of sky. Major Gabreski, now the group's operations officer, led formations from 29,000 feet. He personally launched 6 diving passes during that long engagement, destroying 3 enemy aircraft and damaging 2 more. His combat report described it as the most intense P-47 fight he'd experienced, with aircraft mixing and turning across thousands of miles, consuming enormous quantities of fuel and ammunition. The 56th claimed 22 German kills that day versus 4 P-47s lost, 3 to enemy action and 1 to mechanical issues. The kill ratio of roughly 5.5 to 1 sat slightly below average, but remained impressive given the extended brutal nature. More crucially, bomber losses stayed far lower than predicted. Only 5 B-17s went down, while P-47s provided cover, compared to much heavier losses during unescorted segments. That protective role mattered more than any statistic. February brought Operation Argument, or Big Week as those who flew it called it. 6 days of maximum bombing from February 20th through 25 against German aircraft factories. The 8th Air Force hurled over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties, and the Luftwaffe threw everything at them. The 56th flew 16 major missions through Big Week and beyond, logging more combat time than any other fighter group in the theater. The diving tactics honed over 9 months of fighting were now being flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat against German pilots getting progressively less experienced. The results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Through Big Week and into early March, the 56th destroyed roughly 87 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, shattering previous monthly records. On February 20th, escorting bombers to Leipzig, They destroyed 15 German fighters with 0 losses. February 22nd saw them escorting to Halberstadt and destroying 12 more. These mounting losses shattered the Luftwaffe's daylight air defense. German squadrons were hemorrhaging experienced pilots faster than training could produce replacements. New German pilots arrived at units with minimal experience, often under 50 hours in type, compared to American arrivals logging 150 to 200 hours of training. These green German pilots were especially vulnerable to Thunderbolt dives. They lacked the experience to spot attackers approaching from above. Their defensive moves were often wrong. They panicked and dove reflexively, playing directly into the P-47's greatest advantage. March 1944 saw German air superiority effectively gone. German fighters still appeared, but fewer and far less aggressively. On March 6, the 56th escorted all the way to Berlin and back, encountering not a single German pilot willing to fight at high altitude. The Luftwaffe had learned through blood and loss that taking on P-47s above 25,000 feet meant probable death. P-47 pilots increasingly transitioned to fighter-bomber work, hanging 500 or 1,000-pound bombs and rockets for ground attack. Even in this new role, diving remained essential. Thunderbolts circled above 25,000 feet. They spotted targets like rail yards or truck formations, rolled inverted from altitude in steep 60-degree dives, released ordnance from 4,000 to 6,000 feet, and climbed back to safety before anti-aircraft crews could track and hit them. Physics that made the P-47 dominant in air combat made it equally devastating against ground targets. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who finished as the top American ace in Europe, scored his final victory on July 5, 1944, tallying 28 confirmed kills, every single one flying Thunderbolts with the 56th. 15 days later, on July 20th, luck abandoned him. While attacking a low-level airfield, his Thunderbolt struck Earth, destroying the propeller and forcing him down in enemy territory. Capture followed, and he spent the last 9 months as a prisoner of war. Years later, Gabreski consistently pointed to Zemke's diving tactics as the foundation of the 56th's dominance. When we arrived in January 1943, he recalled, most pilots thought the P-47 was too bulky and slow. British pilots said we'd get murdered. Early on, they seemed right when we tried traditional dogfighting, turning and twisting to get behind enemies. Then Colonel Zemke changed everything. We stopped fighting the German way. We started using what we had: altitude, dive speed, structural toughness. We came from above, hit hard and climbed out before they could respond. We started winning. An aircraft we considered a liability became our deadliest weapon. Robert Johnson completed his tour with 27 confirmed victories in 91 missions, becoming the first USAAF pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's 26 World War I victories. Johnson rotated home in May 1944 and spent the war's remainder on bond drives and training recruits. His memoir Thunderbolt, written with Martin Caden, hammered home the value of discipline and doctrine. Skill and courage counted, Johnson wrote, but proper tactics based on what an aircraft could actually do mattered even more. Tactics built on understanding your aircraft's true advantages will always overcome conventional wisdom about what fighters should do. The P-47 wasn't the most nimble fighter in the sky. It wasn't the quickest climber at lower altitudes. Early war variants had limited range compared to later models, but it was the fastest when pointed downward. It could absorb punishment that would shred lighter fighters, and at high altitude, nothing could touch it. When you built fighting doctrine around these genuine strengths, you got extraordinary results. The 56th Fighter Group's record stands as one of the war's great tactical achievements. They faced skepticism from critics who claimed the aircraft was too heavy, too sluggish for the job. But through careful analysis and relentless testing, they discovered what the machine could actually do. They developed tactics that maximized those genuine capabilities while avoiding situations that played to German strengths. Then they trained those tactics until they became automatic, almost instinctive. Under the most intense pressure imaginable, they held their discipline. The outcome was command of the skies over Germany and protection for thousands of bomber crews who completed their missions under Thunderbolt escort. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 56th during its critical formative period and created the tactical foundation for later success, reflected afterward on this remarkable transformation. When I assumed command in September 1942, he wrote in his memoir after the war, the situation looked desperate. I had an aircraft everyone insisted was wrong for the mission. I had pilots convinced they'd be torn apart by veteran German flyers. I needed to discover what this P-47 could genuinely do, then construct tactics around those real capabilities. Everything came down to the dive. Our aircraft could descend faster than any opponent. We could pull out of dives that would kill other pilots. We could climb back to altitude and repeat. Master this approach, and suddenly we became unstoppable. By war's end, the P-47 demonstrated itself as one of history's most successful fighter aircraft. The aggregate numbers tell part of the story. 746,000 sorties across all types of missions, with a 4.6 to 1 kill ratio overall. But these broad statistics don't fully capture what properly trained units employing correct doctrine actually achieved. The 56th Fighter Group's 11.2 to 1 kill ratio, when counting only aerial combat, or 5.3 to 1 when including all operational losses, showed what could happen with sound tactics and rigorous discipline. Individual pilots who perfected the diving attack reached even more impressive numbers. Francis Gabinski's 28 victories from 166 missions. Robert Johnson's 27 victories from 91 missions. David Schilling's 22 3/4 victories from 132 missions. These success rates approached 1 victory per 4 combat missions. Such sustained rates exceeded what most air forces considered remotely possible. The story of the P-47 and its diving tactics ultimately concerns the victory of analysis over assumption, discipline over improvisation, and physics over tradition. In early 1943, conventional wisdom was certain. Heavy fighters couldn't compete against lightweight, agile opponents. Aviation doctrine since the First World War emphasized turning radius and climb performance. Fighter pilots universally wanted responsive, nimble aircraft that could outturn enemies in tight turning fights. Then American pilots under Zemke's direction took the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built to 30,000 feet. They rolled inverted. They pushed the control stick forward. They discovered that everything the conventional wisdom had taught was fundamentally wrong. They found that dropping straight down at 500 miles per hour was the fastest route to victory. The zoom climb back to altitude proved the most devastating defensive maneuver anyone had ever conceived. They demonstrated that an aircraft's actual capability mattered far more than what military tradition insisted fighters should accomplish. The German pilots who experienced these tactics from below never forgot the lesson. Neither did the Americans executing these missions. Historians studying how a supposedly inadequate fighter achieved dominance over Europe shouldn't forget either. The P-47 pilots began diving straight down because analysis indicated it was the most effective attack method. They kept diving straight down because combat results confirmed what the analysis predicted. They achieved kill ratios approaching 20 to 1 under optimal conditions because physics combined with proper tactics proves more powerful than bravery and tradition. That's how you win air superiority. That's how you keep bombers safe on strategic missions. That's how you bring pilots home despite enemies with experience and determination. You must identify your aircraft's true strengths using rigorous analysis. You develop tactics that capitalize on those strengths while limiting vulnerability to weaknesses. You practice those tactics until they become second nature. You stay disciplined even when instinct pushes you toward abandoning the plan. You roll inverted at 30,000 feet. You direct your nose earthward. You accelerate to 500 miles per hour. You deliver a focused burst. You haul back firmly on the control stick and climb back to altitude before anyone can respond. Execute it correctly. Execute it with discipline. Execute it with wingmen supporting each other, and no pilot in the sky can stop you. That represented the secret the 56th Fighter Group unlocked through months of analysis, training, and battlefield experience. That represented the tactical transformation that altered aerial warfare and enabled American air superiority over Germany. That answered why P-47 pilots pointed their aircraft downward and why they achieved kill ratios approaching 20 to 1 under perfect conditions. The answer wasn't bravery, though that was certainly necessary. The answer wasn't aircraft superiority, though the P-47 possessed real advantages. The answer was superior tactics, grounded in physics and applied with absolute unwavering discipline. That combination proved unbeatable.